Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Welcome to Satya Alam Sambodhi Buddhist Association Facebook page. This is the second in a series of live Dhamma sharing. And just a quick reminder, this is the PowerPoint slides I will be using. So please download this so that you can follow the slides as we go along. All right. As I said, this is the second in the series, and today's topic is physical suffering and mental suffering. Last sharing, we looked at the Four Noble Truths, and let's do a quick recap on that before we get on to physical suffering and mental suffering. So during the last sharing, we covered the Four Noble Truths in a simplified manner based on the first sermon delivered by the Buddha, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutra, setting into motion the wheel of Dhamma, where the Buddha described the noble truths of suffering. And the Four Noble Truths are, firstly, there is dukkha, that we experience all kinds of dukkha. So we're going to take a look at the physical and the mental suffering of dukkha today. And there's a reason why we experience it. So that is to be understood. So the experience of dukkha is to be understood, right? So that is what the Buddha stated. And in the second noble truth, Sambodhi, there is an origin of dukkha. So we have to understand and also abandon these causes of suffering. So these are the things that lead to all kinds of suffering. We got to abandon them. And of course, the good news is that the Buddha stated in the third noble truth that nirodha, that all this can be brought to an end by practicing the Buddha's teachings and bringing it to fruition. And this will lead to the complete cessation of all suffering when we attain the highest and most supreme bliss of Nibbana. So this is nirodha. Nirodha is a very powerful word. It actually means a complete, remainderless cessation of suffering. And this really is to be realized. So we have to realize this, and we have to practice and bring this to fruition. And the way to do that is in the fourth noble truth, where the Buddha stated that there is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. And these are 8 stages of cultivation. So the Buddha told us that these are to be cultivated. So this is really a nutshell of those 4 noble truths. Today, we are going to look specifically at the 2 kinds of suffering, physical suffering and mental suffering. Now, the word dukkha. Dukkha is commonly translated as suffering. And if we just take it as suffering, it means a lot of things. But if we really examine the true meaning of dukkha, dukkha really means a lot of other things. Like, for example, when we experience things that are uncertain, and that creates some kind of insecurity. So dukkha is really a kind of insecurity, that we are uncertain what's going to happen next. At the same time, things that are happening not according to our wishes, we are dissatisfied. So it's also dissatisfactoriness. So you can see dukkha is not just, this great big suffering we're talking about, but all these other kinds of conditions that are really part of the whole thing called dukkha. And all this leads to unhappiness. We are not happy, right? But the most important thing we're going to take a look at are these last 2, that is stress and distress. Stress is the popular term used to describe physical suffering, things that happen within us, and it produces a chain reaction where the body is uncomfortable. So this is the physical suffering, stress. And distress is when the mind gets disturbed, and then we become angry, frustrated, and disappointed, ashamed, and all kinds of emotions arising. So we're going to take a look at these two, physical and mental suffering. Right? Now we can sit there and talk about all the varieties of dukkha. I mean, if you really sit down, you can list down hundreds of them, right? These are just some of the example of what dukkha is all about. Right? But basically, there are really two main areas where we experience suffering, the body and the mind. And that is physical suffering and mental suffering. Now, the Buddha described that there are 5 stages of suffering. Right? These are really 5 consequential stages of suffering. Let me switch to a bigger view. Yes. Now, these are 5 consequential stages of suffering, and the Buddha described them as sokha. In the Pali term, sokha. Sokha actually is commonly translated as sorrow. That is, we're feeling sad. Something happens and it makes us feel unpleasant. So this is the first experience of unpleasantness. And that makes us unhappy or whatever. It leads to a chain reaction of emotions. So it begins with some sorrow and then lamentation. Lamentation is when we want to cry out. When we are experiencing some kind of dissatisfactoriness, now we want to scream out loud. So that is parideva, lamentation. Then comes, the Buddha used the word dukkha here specifically to refer to physical suffering. You see, Pali is a very interesting language. A word like dukkha can be used to mean overall suffering in a big way, or it can also refer to a very specific type of suffering. In this context, in relation to these 5 stages of suffering, the Buddha was really referring to the physical suffering, the physical pain. And we call this stress. So this is really the physical suffering, dukkha. And the mental suffering follows, and that is domanassa, mental anguish, or I call it distress. This is when the mind is disturbed, the mind is unstable, the mind is agitated, right? Running around. So this is distress. It is commonly translated as grief. Now, if we don't take care of all this suffering, it actually becomes a vicious cycle and hurts us so badly that we want to give up. And this is what the Buddha described as upayasa. And this is commonly translated as despair or depression. But it really means exhaustion, expiration, end of the line. And this can be mental and physical. Mental in the sense that we go into deep depression, despair, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So these are the mental aspects of upayasa. But upayasa also has a very dark side. It can carry a physical part. So things like heart attack, cardiac arrest. Suddenly something happens so bad that this trauma is unbearable, and then you end up with a heart attack, cardiac arrest, or a stroke. Or even your mind gets so disturbed, you want to commit suicide and you kill yourself. So these are upayasa, expiration and exhaustion. Now, if you look at these 5 terms, which we find occurring a lot in several sutras, and that is sokha, parideva, dukkha, domanassa, upayasa. Now, a lot of people think of these as 5 different types of suffering, but actually it is not. These are 5 stages, consequential stages, which are progressive. When I say progressive, I mean that it actually progresses from sokha to parideva and so on. So when something happens that hurt us, the first experience is some form of sorrow. Then we begin to realize something is hurting us. So we feel sorrow, and then we want to cry out, we want to scream, we feel unhappy, and then we want to lash out. That is parideva, lamentation. All this is because of the two things that's happening. First, the body is uncomfortable. That is dukkha, the physical pain. And then the mental anguish arises. When the body is uncomfortable, it disturbs the mind, and this mental pain and mental anguish arises. Up to this point, we better do something to stop the causes, or change the way we respond to it, or change the way we perceive what's going on. Otherwise, we could end up in upayasa. And as I said, upayasa is the expiration. It can be physical, and that is cardiac arrest, stroke, right? And it can also be mental, to the point that we feel suicidal. So we better stop it, stop this dukkha, or do something about the dukkha before it reaches that last stage, upayasa. So these are 5 consequential stages. They are progressive stages. How does dukkha affect us? Now, as I pointed out, first, it affects our body. So we call this physiological, right? So it affects us in a physiological manner. It affects the body, making the body uncomfortable. And this is because of a whole series of hormones being released. So it is a chain reaction of hormones being released. And then it also affects us mentally or psychologically. So the mind is affected. So this is really a kind of mental suffering. But at the same time, the brain is processing all this, so it also affects the brain in a way that there is a neurological reaction. The brain sends message to various parts of the body, causing the organs in the body to react in their own unique ways, right? So this is really how dukkha affects us, affecting the body, affecting the mind, and affecting the brain, because you see, we remember something because we reflect upon it, because we think about it. If something happens and we don't think about it anymore, we probably will never remember it again. But if something happens and we focus our mind on it, we think about it, and this thinking about it causes the brain to develop this neural network, where this set of memory is really a series of neural networks, neurons firing together. And if we keep reflecting on something unpleasant, these neurons are being repeatedly fired. So the neural network is repeatedly fired. That becomes memory. And that is very harmful. So we have to be very careful that dukkha affects us in all these different ways. So first, let's take a look at mind as an activity, right? This mental process. Now, I have explained this before, but the Buddha has very brilliantly explained that the Buddha used 3 words to describe the mind. So the mind is really an activity. It is not an entity. It doesn't exist. It is something that is just happening. So what actually is going on is a lot of reactions going on in the brain and the body and the central nervous system and various parts of the body. All this leads to this experience of we call mind. So mind is the activity. There are 3 parts of this experience. And of course, the first part is vijnana, the ability to perceive through our senses, when we are able to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. So all these 5 senses carry information into the brain, and it gets processed. And there is a mental image arising. So when you see something, there is a visual mental image. When you hear something, there is an auditory mental image. That means in your mind, there is the image of a sound, right? When you smell something, then there is an aromatic mental image, the smell. Or you taste, there is a flavor mental image. Or you touch, there is a tangible mental image. So this mental image is perception, vijnana. This arises because of panchakanda, the 5 aggregates. The mind processes every perception that arises, and the part of the mind that processes it is mano, commonly called the cognitive process. And that leads us to become aware of what we have seen, what we have heard, smell, taste, and touch. We interpret. We're able to give a label. We see something, we call it, we see a cat passing by, we call it a cat. So giving it a label, right, to identify what we have experienced through our senses. So this is mano, and it produces 2 processes, that is cognition and conception. Cognition is the ability to think, and conception is the ability to create. So the mind creates stories. So when you see something, you realize what it is. You see a cat passing by and you think, oh, there's a cat and he's trying to cross the road. And then there is traffic coming. So it's very dangerous for the cat. So when you begin to create stories like that, that is conception. When you see the cat, you're aware this is a cat. That is cognition. So cognition is really the awareness of what was perceived through your senses. Conception is creating the story behind it, right? So then comes chitta, the 3rd aspect of the mind. Chitta is the affective process, which the lay term for that is really emotions. It leads to 2 conditions, right? 2 kinds of experience, mood and temperament. Whatever we experience, everything we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch, there is a certain sensation and feeling associated with it, whether it is something that seems pleasant, or something that is unpleasant, or something that is neither pleasant nor unpleasant. And this really depends on the individual. This does not mean everybody has the same experience. Take, for example, durian. To us, people who love durian, the moment we smell durian, we feel good. Feeling good means you are in a good mood. So that is the mood, the feeling good. And then we are interested. We want to see where's the durian, and then we may want to try it. And that is really our emotional urge. So that is really the temperament. So mood is associated with the feeling, right? The feeling of whether it is pleasant or unpleasant, and that leads to the mood. And then temperament is this emotional urge to want to do something about it. So these are all part of this process of chitta and affective process, commonly called emotions. At the same time, we cling on to every experience. We think that, oh, I am feeling this, I like this, I don't like this. So there is this clinging process going on, upadana, that we cling on to it. My teacher, Bhante Punaji, actually calls it personalization because of the Pali term upadana. Very quick word, very quick one on what upadana is. It comes from 2 key words, upa and adana. Right? Upa means within, inside us, upa, right? Inside us. Adana is the opposite of dana. You know what is dana? Dana is giving. In Pali, when you put the A in front, it is the opposite of it. So instead of giving, it is taking. So upadana is, adana means to take it and bring it inside. This is commonly translated as grasping or clinging or attachment. But the more precise term to describe this, very precisely and easily understood, is personalizing. You personalize it that, oh, this is my experience. I am feeling this. I like this. I don't like this. So the I, me, or mine becomes very strong. So these are the 3 processes of the mind. So we have to be aware that it affects us in a lot of ways. If whatever that is going on out there that we perceive, we process, we cognize, and we conceive, and then we begin to feel affection towards it and then react to it. This is really our process of experience. In the brain, now we talk about the brain, there's a correlation between our mind and the brain. Now, the mind is not just what's going on in the brain, is really the whole central nervous system and the whole body. So the mind is really the activity of the entire body, the central nervous system, and the brain. But the main part, that is the command center, the main processing part, is the brain. And there is a correlation. So this brainstem is the oldest part of the brain that carries signals from the body. So all the nerves coming from the body enter through the brain, and the top of the spinal cord, they come through the spinal cord. At the end of the spinal cord is this brainstem. The nerves go into the brain and it is processed. So all the nerves coming from your sense organs are brought in. So this is the part of the brain that is associated with your perception, right? Vijnana. And then in the middle part, the limbic system, and this is the part commonly called the emotional brain, and it processes it. So this is associated with the affective process. Affective process means it produces a chain reaction that affects us, right? And basically this is commonly called emotional brain, because this is the part where it is the beginning of an emotional chain reaction. And of course, we are endowed with the outer part of the brain, the ability to think. So this is the cerebral cortex, and this is the cognitive process, that we are able to think. And this is the thinking part. This is the intelligence part, helping us to understand things and make decisions. So these are the three parts of the brain correlated with these activities going on. Now, there are two parts of the brain. One part is responsible for our suffering. The other part is responsible for our happiness. So when we experience something out there, the body begins to change. This is because of what's going on in the limbic system. There is a structure called the amygdala. The amygdala senses all sensory perception coming in, and it reacts to these by producing a chain reaction called the fight or flight reaction. So the amygdala, in a way, is the bodyguard to protect us from harm by producing this fight or flight reaction. And this reaction protects us in a way, we don't have time to think. For example, if somebody threw a basketball at your face and the basketball is coming towards you, fast approaching object, what happens is that, do you have time to think, oh, that basketball is heading towards me? If I don't catch it, duck it, or hit it away, it's going to hit my face. It'll be very painful. So it's time for me to do something. Do you have time to think like that? No. It's the amygdala that is reacting. What happens is the amygdala is sensing fast approaching object, produces a release of hormones, and causes a chain reaction whereby we either push the ball away, that is called fighting it, or we duck and trying to get out of the way, and that is flight. That's why it's called fight or flight reaction. And that's why the amygdala can be called our bodyguard, protecting us from harm. But unfortunately, the amygdala sometimes overreacts or sometimes becomes aroused unnecessarily. How can it be aroused unnecessarily? Well, you're sitting there reading a book peacefully, reading the newspaper or a Dhamma book, and maybe your mother or sister or whoever has finished cooking come from behind you and wanted to let you know dinner is ready, but of course they didn't want to say anything. They just touch you on the shoulder. Now, if you're deeply engrossed reading book and somebody suddenly comes touch you on the shoulder, what happens? Oh, you get this shock. This is the work of the amygdala, and the amygdala can be unnecessarily aroused and produce all kinds of chain reaction. So it's like a terrorist in your brain. If you don't learn to tame the reaction of the amygdala, you are constantly getting these hormones being released. Your whole body will be suffering. So this is really the physical suffering. Amygdala produces this physical suffering. Fortunately, we're endowed with another part of the brain that can help us experience happiness. And this is our thinking brain, the cerebral cortex, made of these 4 different lobes, and they're responsible for all these brain functions. But it is these bottom 2 lines that are most important, and these are the activity of that little bit of the brain right behind the eyebrow called the prefrontal cortex. Sometimes they abbreviate as PFC, the prefrontal cortex. Remember these 2 terms, amygdala and prefrontal cortex. These are opposite, right? The amygdala is the one that causes chain reaction where we experience suffering. Prefrontal cortex has the power and the ability to bring down the whole thing, and because we are able to think more clearly. And this thinking process is done by this part of the brain, the PFC, prefrontal cortex, where we're able to set good goals, we are able to plan and prepare and take action, we're able to reason out right from wrong, we're able to look at the cause and effect and rationalize our resources, how we can actually do something to help ourselves become happier. So this is the part of the brain that can help us to be happy if we learn to train this brain. And one of the most important training of this part of the brain is meditation. So it's very helpful that we find time to meditate regularly. And this actually helps to train this part of the brain, because meditation begins with observing, attention, right? Paying attention, right? Attention with discernment, right? This is observing with discernment. And this is really training this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. Now, when the amygdala is aroused, it causes a chain reaction. And the brain sends a message to the various glands, and the adrenal gland releases 2 very powerful stress hormones, causing the heart to beat faster, blood pressure to rise, our muscle get all tensed up, and so on, right? And a whole lot of chain reaction in the body. Our facial expression distorted, our pupils dilate, and body tremble, body temperature rises, and so on. Even blood sugar increases. All this you can see are very unhealthy to the body. So this is really the physical suffering, this fight or flight reaction that happens in us because of the release of the hormones. This is causing physical suffering. And this is the first thing that ever happens the moment we experience something where there's a feeling associated with it. And if that feeling is pleasant, this happens too. When the feeling is unpleasant, this happens. That, neurologically, it's the same. When it is something pleasant, then your body can be stressed because you're excited. Oh, I just show you. For example, if it is something unpleasant, right, something you don't like, you have this feeling. Maybe I'll just open up my screen better. Okay. So when you experience something unpleasant, you will have this reaction, your facial expression distort. What if you experience something so pleasant, so enjoyable, you really indulging in this sensual pleasure? How different is that? These are all chain reaction because of the release of hormones. So this is really, there's no difference, in that sense. It's just that different types of hormones are being released, causing different experiences, but they're still stressing the body. Even when you're indulging in sensual pleasures, your body is stressed. And this stress reaction is not good for you. This is why even indulging in sensual pleasure can be dukkha. Not only because you might lose that pleasurable source, but also your body is experiencing this kind of physical suffering, right? So this is the physical suffering that I'm trying to explain today. And there is a process behind it. We're going to take a deeper look at it It's called the general adaptation syndrome. So we're going to come to that in a moment. So let's take a look at a short video on this origin of emotions.
Emotions are generated by structures hidden deep in the brain. The tiny almond-shaped amygdala is the first to respond to an emotional event, triggering a series of split-second reactions within the brain's emotional core. Waves of nerve impulses travel down the brainstem, setting off an instantaneous visceral response throughout the body.
A lot of the time, the machinery that produces the emotion is operating without us noticing it at all, creating changes in posture and facial expression, altering the way the organs inside the body are working, preparing the body for what's needed next, generating chemical responses that you will never know existed. And all of this is what constitutes the emotional state.
For most people, awareness of a feeling follows just milliseconds after an emotion is created. The body sends signals back to the area of the brain responsible for conscious thought, making us aware of our feelings.
So you can see emotions begin with something that is physical. So emotions begin with something that is physical. It affects us physically, so, because it begins to release hormones, and only when we begin to feel these sensations and our thinking brain becomes aware of this sensation, then only we begin to be aware that emotion has arisen. But it hurts us physically first, right? So remember now that physical suffering begins, right? So if we look at the process of experience, this is what happens. So let me pull up the screen. Okay, the process of experience is a chain reaction. When activities in the environment stimulate our sense organs, we are able to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch through our sense organs. Then we have the awareness of what was seen, heard, smell, taste, and touch. And this is vijnana, the awareness. It produces a mental image. So this is the perception that we were talking about, the process of perception, arising because of pancha khanda, the five aggregates. Now that we have seen, heard, smelled, tasted, or touched something, the mind begins to process. So the cognitive process kicks in. This is mano. How does it process? So whatever you have seen with your eyes or heard with your ears and so on, it refers to memory from the past to try to interpret what was seen. So if it is something that you have seen before, like for example, a bottle of mineral water, you have seen hundreds of different types of mineral water before. If somebody brings you another new brand of mineral water, straight away you can tell it's a bottle of mineral water because you have memory of past experiences. So this mano process, the cognitive process of mano, draws from memory to try to interpret. So this process of interpreting what was perceived is called papancha. So you're able to interpret, and it produces an awareness. And this awareness of what you have seen is just the Dhamma, the experience, or recognition. So this is the cognitive process producing the recognition. Well, recognition, if you look at that word clearly, it actually means recognition. That's where the word recognition comes in. You recognize something, right? And with everything that you recognize, there is a feeling associated with it, right? So this recognition is the cognition part, and then you begin to carry some ideas or stories behind it, and that is conception. With everything you see, hear, smell, taste, and touch that you recognize, there is a feeling associated with it. So it is either pleasant or unpleasant or neutral, or what we call neutral. It is actually neither pleasant nor unpleasant. So this is the chitta part, the mano. is the part that recognizes, the chitta is the part that feels whether it is pleasant or unpleasant, leading to mood and temperament. So whether it is pleasant or unpleasant, the chitta kicks off a chain reaction. And this is where the amygdala gets triggered. And there is a chain reaction going on and producing the release of hormones. And these hormones are really the biochemical reaction in the body. And they are causing tensions in the body. When tensions in the body arise, you feel this tension. And this is called stress. This is the physiological disturbance, the physical suffering. So for lack of a better word, I use the word stress to refer to this physical suffering or dukkha. Well, dukkha, of course, can mean the big thing, suffering, and a whole lot of other things. But in this context, in the context of the 5 consequential stages of suffering, dukkha is referring to this pain or physical suffering. And there was a very famous endocrinologist by the name of Hans Selye. Hans Selye described this process and called it the general adaptation syndrome. And this is really a very thorough explanation of how stress arises, how it affects us, how it makes us behave, and how we behave in different ways. So this is really what Hans Selye described in this general adaptation syndrome. He described that there are 3 stages, and this is the very first stage. He called this alarm reaction. So the moment we experience something pleasant or unpleasant, alarm reaction kicks off. And that produces the chain reaction of biochemical reaction. The body becomes uncomfortable and the body becomes tensed. So this is alarm reaction. So Hans Selye described general adaptation syndrome in 3 stages. And I will just very quickly run through. So alarm reaction is this very first stage. And this is commonly called the freeze, fight, or flight reaction. And then we become aware of it. And that is when the stage of resistance arises. This is our reaction. Well, in Pali, this is really tanha, our reaction. We begin to react to it. If it is something pleasant, we crave for it. We want it. We want more of it. Greed and lust arises. If it is something unpleasant, we get angry towards it. So this is really the stage of resistance, our reaction to what has been perceived, right? Recognition of threats or efforts to cope with the threats. And the third stage is that if we are not able to resolve this suffering, then it leads to stage of exhaustion, where we either mentally give up or the body gives up. Exhaustion of resources. So the body gives up in the form of heart attack, cardiac arrest, stroke, and the mind gives up in the form of depression, despair, giving up, and even suicidal thoughts, post-traumatic stress disorder. So this is really exhaustion. So these are the 3 stages. Bhante Punaji will explain these 3 stages.
Hans Selye, who spoke about stress, he spoke about a thing called the general adaptation syndrome, which has 3 parts: the alarm reaction, the stage of resistance, and the stage of exhaustion. Alarm reaction means, now if someone dies or some close relative dies, we begin to cry and lament. Grief and lamentation. That is the meaning of soka parideva. Soka means grief, parideva means lamentation. And then that is called the alarm reaction. That means we react in this way when that someone dies or something very unpleasant happens. Then if we keep on crying and lamenting, say for 1 month, And at that time, people will not be even able to eat or sleep properly. If you are crying and lamenting for 1 month, what happens? Your body becomes completely sick and all kinds of pains come into the body. And not only that, even your mind is depressed. That is called the stage of resistance, because you are resisting what happened. You are not willing to accept the death of your mother or your father or your brother or sister or whoever. And that is a stage of sickness in the body. And then, if it still continues beyond 1 month, what will happen? You will be completely exhausted, and as a result, you might even either commit suicide or you might automatically die. That is called the stage of exhaustion. And this is all in the words of the Buddha. Soka parideva is the alarm reaction. Dukkha domanassa. Dukkha is the physical pain, domanassa is the mental pain. That is the stage of resistance. And then the last stage is upayasa. Upayasa means exhaustion, where you might even commit suicide or die. So this is really a very interesting thing that the modern scientists who are explaining these things, they are really talking about what the Buddha has been saying long time ago. So this shows that the teachings of the Buddha is so important, and also it is a fact. It's not just a blind belief. So it is very important to understand these things and begin to practice these things so that you can be free from all sufferings of samsara.
You have just heard Bhante Punnaji explain this general adaptation syndrome, the 3 stages, and how it connects with the 5 consequential stages of suffering that the Buddha spoke about. Right? So let's look at this further, how it affects the mind. Now, emotions. When all this is happening, it actually arouses emotion. And how is emotion aroused? Emotion has 2 dimensions. There is a physical part, a physiological part that I have just described. So what I have described earlier on is the physiological part, the physical part of emotions. It leads to physical pain and physical suffering first. And we call this stress or dukkha. There is then the mental part, the psychological part, which I call distress or domanassa. The Buddha calls it domanassa, the mental suffering. So this is the psychological effect. And emotions actually have 2 major activities, the arousal as well as the reactions. So let's take a look at the arousal and the reactions. First, the physical part has already occurred. I have explained to you the physical part. So this is the physical part where there is a biochemical chain reaction. Hormones are released, causing body tensions, and body becomes very uncomfortable. And this great discomfort is felt. And this is the physiological disturbance, physical pain, stress, dukkha. When dukkha arises, it affects the mind. So when we experience this physical discomfort, then we become aware there is suffering. And this awareness leads to a mental chain reaction in the chitta, where the chitta then kicks up kicks off this memory, imagination, and expectations. Memory is recalling past experiences. Imagination is trying to create a future that hasn't happened yet. And expectation is trying to change the present that is already there, already has happened. So whether we are recalling something that is long gone in the past, or we are thinking of something that hasn't happened at all, it's just our imagination, or we're trying to change something that is already there, right here and there in front of us with our expectations, all these are suffering. It leads to three kinds of behavior: lobha, dosa, moha. And so this emotional arousal disturbs the thinking mind. So the chitta actually is disturbing the mano. And this disturbance causes distress, where the mind is being torn. Right? So the mind is being torn because of the battle or the conflict between the chitta and the mano. See, the chitta and the mano, they are not working together. Very quickly digress for a moment. They work together only when you are in meditation and you experience jhana. That's why they call it the unification of the mind. So in jhana, the mind is unified, meaning both chitta and mano are working in harmony, in unison. But other than that, outside the experience of jhana, the chitta and the mano are often in conflict. They are fighting. So this conflict is a tug of war going on in the mind. And this is causing a lot of mental suffering, distress, or what the Buddha called domanassa. This is emotional excitement leading to mental proliferation. The mind runs away with all kinds of crazy thoughts, all kinds of endless thoughts, and disturbing your peace of mind. Okay? And this is causing you to react. And this is what Hanseli called stage 2, the stage of resistance. We begin to react. And what kind of reaction? Well, there are three kinds: lobha, dosa, and moha. Lobha is when it is something pleasant, we react in the form of lust and greed towards the pleasantness. Dosa is when there is something unpleasant, we react in the form of anger and hatred towards the unpleasantness. And that is dosa. And then moha is really the self-centeredness. We are clinging and grasping to that experience. We're personalizing it and say, I am feeling it, I don't like it. So the I, me, or mine is strong, and that is the moha, the delusion of self-centered existence. So this is really how emotions really hurt us. This is the mental suffering I call distress. And the Buddha's word for this is domanassa. Because here it is differentiated between physical suffering, dukkha, or stress, and mental suffering, domanassa, or distress. And it controls us. This reaction of the chitta controls us. So let's listen to Bhante Punnaji's explanation of this.
So in the human being, the thinking part is called mano, whereas the emotional part is called chitta. What the Buddha pointed out was, what has to be done is not to obey the chitta. What is happening today is that the mano part, the thinking part, is doing what the chitta wants. You see, chitta is dominating the mind. And the mano is just catering to the chitta. There is a verse where the Buddha says, Chittena niyati loko, chittena parikassati, chittassa eka dhammassa, sabbeva vasamangvagu. What that means is, chitta is dominating the world. Chittena niyati loko. Loka is the world. Chittena niyati loko. Chittena parikassati. Chitta is disturbing everything. Chittassa eka dhammassa. Chitta is that one thing. Sabbeva vasamangvagu. That everyone is spellbound by chitta. Everyone is dominated by chitta. Like being spellbound. So therefore, the only thing is to learn how to gain control over the chitta, the emotional part.
Okay, you've just heard what Bhattipunaji has described is how chitta dominates and controls us because of the way we interpret our circumstances. So by the way we interpret our circumstances, it arouses emotions. In other words, if something happens out there and we feel pleasant or unpleasant towards it, if we were to interpret it in a positive way, a wholesome way, we might not feel so emotionally aroused. But if we were to interpret it in a negative way or an unwholesome way or a vicious way, it arouses our emotions and we become angry or hateful or whatever to it. So it's really the way we interpret our circumstances. We will be dominated by emotions if we are not careful with how we interpret circumstances. Example, let's talk about something pleasurable, pleasant experience. Durian, everybody loves durian. So the moment your neighbor invites you to go over and have durian, joining a durian party, don't get too excited and indulgent. It just interpret it as, oh, it's a kind invitation. Just go there and have a good time, fellowship. Don't go crazy about the durian. So it's the way you interpret your circumstances, right? So this is really what that is about. Now, if we don't learn to tame our emotions, it leads to a very vicious cycle of chain reaction. So in other words, first, you can see here, biochemical chain reaction happens and we feel this bodily discomfort. And this triggers mental process and the mind is being disturbed, being torn between our feeling, our emotional feeling, and our thinking, our rational thinking, our reasoning. So the mind is being torn and we're experiencing distress. If we don't do anything about it, this distress actually produces more hormonal reaction because it causes the amygdala to go into high gear. So the amygdala becomes hyperactive, producing more hormones. And this is a very dangerous, vicious cycle, chain reaction we must avoid. And this is really producing hormones and making us even more tensed, and it actually leads us to deep depression. This is what is called the amygdala hijack, where the amygdala is now stuck in a high gear and it is really producing hormones and making us feeling unhappy. There's physical suffering, mental suffering, and it continues to produce more and more hormone. It can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. It can lead to depression. It can lead to despair where you give up. It can even lead to suicidal thoughts. or physically, this high doses of hormone can actually causes cardiac arrest, heart attack, and this depression or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, may even cause you to want to be suicidal. Right? So this is what Hans Selye described as stage 3 of general adaptation syndrome. It's the stage of expiration or the stage of exhaustion. And this is really the amygdala hijack reaction. So let's take a look at a video on this.
At Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, scientists are examining the fear response, scanning the brains of people with and without post-traumatic stress disorder. One part of the brain in every test subject is highly responsive: the amygdala.
The amygdala is a small structure which cares a lot about threat and fear. If there's something that may be potentially harmful to us, it is a brain area which gets activated very quickly and recruits other areas of the brain to try to deal with this unexpected circumstance.
The amygdala sends outputs to the body so that your muscles begin to tense, hormones are released, blood pressure goes up, and all of these are part of the protective response of the body designed by evolution to help you stay alive. Imagine you're walking down a path in the woods and all of a sudden there's a curved object that looks like a snake on the ground, and you find yourself stopping with your leg resting above that object, and you look down and see that it's simply a stick. So why did your leg stop like that?
In the normal brain, the amygdala acts like an early warning system, alerting us to danger. But the amygdala does not act on its own. The frontal cortex, where we think and reason, plays a crucial role.
There are two parallel routes of fear processing in the brain. One will go directly to the amygdala. It's a quick and dirty pathway and trigger a fear reaction unconsciously. But then as the information slowly makes its way to the cortex perceives the difference between the stick and the snake and says it's only a stick.
Once the discerning cortex has determined that there is no call for panic, it sends a message to the amygdala, quieting the fear response. But in post-traumatic stress disorder, the cortex is held hostage by a volatile amygdala. Thinking is hijacked by emotion.
People with PTSD are very sensitively tuned to pick up threat and respond to even very minor stimuli as if their life were in danger.
So this is really the amygdala hijack leading to post-traumatic stress disorder. So what is this post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, what happens is that when you experience something that is traumatic, a trauma, something that hurts you emotionally, and it's stuck in your mind and you're not able to let go. And when you're not able to let go, you keep recalling it. And that recall, each time you recall it, the whole body is reacting. So, and you're stuck in that. So this is really post-traumatic stress disorder. And this causes people to go into depression when they experience something traumatic. If they don't learn to relax and let go and release and not cling on to that experience, they will experience depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. So now let's examine this whole process, the chain reaction that Buddha described as the 5 stages, right? So there are consequences to this, and the Buddha described 5 stages, 5 consequential stages of dukkha. First is sukha, which is sorrow. We begin to feel something unpleasant. And then there is parideva, which is lamentation. We begin to scream or cry or shout or whatever. This is corresponding to what Hans Selye described as stage 1, alarm reaction. Then we experience this physical suffering and the mental suffering, dukkha for physical pain and domanassa for mental anguish or distress. This corresponds to what Hans Selye described as the stage of resistance. And if we are not able to stop this, and if we continue to experience this, we will fall into post-traumatic stress disorder or depression. And this is what the Buddha described as upayasa, stage of exhaustion. And this is corresponding to stage 3 of the general adaptation syndrome, stage of exhaustion or stage of expiration, expiring, either by way of heart attack, cardiac arrest, stroke, or by way of depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, or even suicide. What can we do about it? Now, I spoke about this. Oh, just give me a second. Okay. We spoke about this before. So what can we do about this? We can actually practice what I call the 3-step self-compassion. When something happens out there and our emotions become aroused, so when something happens out there, our emotions become aroused and the body changes. Instead of reacting right away, pause, don't react. The reason is that if you react right away, your reaction is very emotional and you are not going to solve the problem. You're probably going to aggravate it further. So pause, don't react, and then relax by deep breathing. I'm going to teach you a simple technique that can help you calm your emotion very easily. So this is through a process of relaxation. And then think about how you can respond to it. Think is an acronym, right? So pause, relax, and think. So when your emotions are aroused, don't react, pause. Allow time for emotional excitement and anxiety to calm down and the hormonal reactions to subside. And then you relax. Take deep breaths, relax the body, and consciously compose the mind to respond. Finally, then only you think. Think is an acronym we'll come to in a moment. Relax. What is a good way to relax? Well, I actually teach this a lot in my previous classes where I teach people about relaxation. I call this the LSD breathing, which is consciously allow breathing to slow down, which helps to relax the body and calm the mind. So this means you allow, do not exert effort, do not be forceful, just allow and take long, allow your breathing to go longer. So in other words, if you think about it, you're breathing now normally. How fast do you breathe? We breathe too quickly, sometimes maximum maybe 2 seconds in, 2 seconds out, Even in a normal stage, most of us go. So it's 2 or 3 seconds at the most. Here, allow your breathing to go on for 4 or 5 seconds. So when you get excited, don't react, pause, and then take a deep breath. Allow your breathing to go longer. Just allow it. Don't exert effort, just allow it. Consciously allow and do it slowly. Don't rush it. Just allow your breathing to go on, and then only you take deeper breath. So you begin by allowing it to go longer and then slow it down a bit more, and then only take deeper breath. As you breathe in, take a deeper breath. So this is a simple technique. So this is in the presentation slides, so you can actually practice this on your own. So LSD, long breathing, slow it down, and take it deep. Think. So now come to think. So you begin to speak out, or you begin to act. So before you speak or act, think is an acronym. T. T means truthful. Is something truthful? H. H means, is it helpful? Right? So before you speak or act, ask yourself, is what I'm about to say, is that truthful? And what I'm about to say, will it help the situation? Will it help me to recover from this situation? I, T-H-I, I means improve. Will it improve the situation for me? Will it help me adapt to what's going on? So it's about recovering and adapting. So will it help me recover? Will it help me adapt? And then sometimes, even if it is the truth, ask yourself, is it necessary to say it? Because some things are not necessary. By saying it, you may even either cause the other party to become more upset, or you may arouse more reactions from yourself. And finally, the most important of all, every time, every thought you carry, every speech you make, and every action you take, always do it with kindness. T-H-I-N-K, think. That is truthful, helpful, improving, necessary, and kind. So this is really what you can do to help yourself. So pause, relax, and think. So let's summarize by taking a quick look at the mindfulness of stress and distress. That means you become mindful of what's going on. So this is a summary of what we can do, what we have covered today. Recognize that you are experiencing this stress reaction, freeze, fight, or flight. That means when something arouses your emotion, be aware that it is causing bodily discomfort. And beware, you have to be careful that this physical suffering leads to mental suffering, distress, if you don't calm down quickly. That means if you don't relax the body, compose the mind, it can actually lead to mental suffering, distress. And the simple practice is this 3-step self-compassion. Pause, relax, and think. Think is an acronym. Truthful, helpful, improving, necessary, and kind. And relaxing, you consciously allow breathing to slow down by practicing the LSD breathing. Long, slow, deep breathing. All right? And finally, with every thought, with every speech, and with every action, always consider THINK for a peaceful response, whether it is truthful, helpful, improving, necessary, or kind. Right? So this is basically what we have covered today. I hope this has been helpful for you. And I'm very grateful to my teacher, Venerable Punaji. So the late Venerable Punaji has been very helpful to me. He has taught me a lot of things. He has been very instrumental in motivating me to share my knowledge in presenting Dhamma in a scientific and modern perspective. So I hope this has been helpful to you. And Bhante has been very instrumental to my Dhamma learning and practice and sharing. So I basically wish that Bhante Punaji will attain the highest and most supreme bliss of Nibbana. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So very thankful to Bhante Punaji. So now it comes to the end of our sharing for now. If you have questions, please feel free. If you want to ask me questions later, you can send by email. By the way, you can download the slides, the PDF file containing the slides, right? tiny.cc/sasba-dukkha, okay? So download that and you can get all the slides. Right? So since there are no questions, let us pay homage to the Buddha. During this past hour or so, we have accumulated, by sharing the Dhamma, we have accumulated a lot of good merits. We must think about what is happening around the world today. A lot of people are still suffering from coronavirus pandemic. Millions and millions of people around the world are suffering. And sad to say, hundreds and hundreds of thousands, in fact, almost 1 million by now, 1 million people have died from coronavirus pandemic. So for those who have put in an effort to help others during this coronavirus pandemic, some have in fact sacrificed their life. So we should share our merits with them. So let us put our palms together and share these merits and recite together. We dedicate the merits we have acquired from sharing of the Buddha Dhamma to all beings affected by the coronavirus pandemic around the world. May suffering beings be suffering free. May the fear-struck fearless be. May grieving beings shed all grief. May all beings find peace and relief. By the grace of the merits we have acquired, may we never follow the foolish. May we follow only the wise until we attain the highest and most supreme bliss of Nibbana. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. All right, that is all for now. Thank you very much for joining us. This is Satya Alam Sambodhi Buddhist Association Facebook Live. This is the second sharing that we have just concluded. Join us again 2 weeks from now, same time, 10 a.m. for the third sharing, where I will be explaining what are some of the mindfulness techniques we can actually apply and cultivate so that we become more relaxed and relieved from the harmful effects of stress and distress. And with this, I wish all of you stay safe. May you be well, comfortable, peaceful, and happy. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.